This podcast was made possible by our members on armchairhistory.tv. Use code ARMCHAIRCHATS for 60% off of your first month. Luke asks, what would have happened in Britain if Britain chose to negotiate a settlement with Germany after the defeat of France rather than fight on? This is a difficult question. I think the most intuitive answer, the shortest answer, is the war probably would have gone on longer and that the Soviet Union would have eventually beat the Germans. And, Britain helped expedite the victory, but they weren't as integral. However, the one counterpoint I will say to this is, do I want to say maybe one or two things on this? The counterpoint is the Soviets were so heavily reliant on Lend-Lease coming in from America and Britain, especially. In fact, I had posted, as of now, early June 2024, I posted a poll on my YouTube channel, or a quiz, about the most produced British tank. And it wasn't like the stuff you were seeing in Normandy, like their Fireflies or the Cromwells and that sort of thing. It was Valentines. And a lot of Valentines, you'll actually see Valentines and some Matildas, those sorts of tanks you'll see on the Eastern Front, actually. So even the British are sending over, I think, I could be completely wrong on this, by the way, but I think Britain produced, I think I read somewhere that Britain produced the most tanks out of everyone. It's just that they exported a ton of tanks and they were going everywhere. So I will say that the Soviets were super reliant on both Britain and America. And if Britain fell, or joined the Germans, or blocked off all that trade, and America couldn't get the Lend-Lease in for whatever reason, I don't know if Britain maybe cut off naval access, or, like I said, joined the Germans and was actively trying to stop the trade, I think the Soviets would have actually been in more danger. The British couldn't have taken on the Americans completely on their own, but they would have definitely stalled the Americans. So really the biggest changes in how World War II would have happened is, will the Soviets still get their Lend-Lease, or the amount of Lend-Lease that they were getting before? And the answer is probably no. So yeah, that's a huge factor. And would the British be delaying the Americans long enough that the Soviets could win? But if the Soviets are not getting as much Lend-Lease, would they have been able to win? Especially if the British... I mean, one thing I will say, too, a lot of revisionism has taken place where people are saying, well, look, we've over-glorified the Normandy landings and the Allied contribution to World War II. The Soviets were probably going to win on their own. I will say, though, that Normandy and Bagration were timed both in June of 1944. It was not like the Allies were doing their own thing. Like, Stalin was begging the Allies to open up another front. The Soviets were losing so many men. So I do feel like people underestimate what the Allies did, both on a logistical role and alleviating some of the pressure that the Soviets were dealing with. If the Germans knew there was no pressure, and in fact there was support from the British, and the British could fully hold the Western Front and for the Germans, and the Germans could take all of those troops off of Italy and France and move all of them to the Eastern Front, and the Russians aren't getting a Lend-Lease, I would think it'd be way closer, or I think the Soviets would actually have a good chance of losing. So if I were to recap, I would say, if you said the British and the Americans didn't join the war, but they continued their Lend-Lease, or they were even more aggressive with the Lend-Lease because they didn't need the equipment for themselves, I think the Soviets probably still would have won. It just would have taken longer. If you're saying, though, that the British really tried to help the Germans in the best way they could, they blocked trade from the United States, they didn't send anything to the Soviet Union, and they were actively helping the Germans and holding Britain and France in that Western area, I think the Germans actually have a higher chance than the Soviets did of winning. So maybe you could look at it this way. With the British support, to me, intuitively, and no Lend-Lease, that means I would say the Germans are now looking at like a 60 or 70% chance to win the war. However, I'd invert that stat. In real life, I think the Germans probably had like a 10% chance of winning, which is quite low. But if the British are just neutral, not stopping the Lend-Lease, maybe they're even contributing to it, but they're not in the war, then the Germans go up to maybe like a 30% win rate or 30% chance to win. I'm just kind of making these numbers up, but that's just kind of what I feel based on my knowledge. So it would really take active support and the active role of the British to stop trade coming in for the Soviet Union to really halt the Soviet war effort, I would say. And especially think about it this way too. Imagine the British, all those tanks they sent to the Eastern Front to help the Russians. Maybe if the British helped the Germans, maybe the British are Lend-Leasing the Germans and sending them equipment and materials and all of those materials that they're getting from their colonies. So imagine all of the iron and steel, zinc, all of these materials that go into building manufactories and weapons and tanks. All the British are gathering all those resources from all around their empire and sending it to the Germans and financing their war. That could really, that's where I get that 60 to 70% chance where the Germans could actually win it in that case. Because it's not only that the Soviets aren't being lend-leased, but if the Germans are actively being supported, that really changes things. And if all of that pressure is alleviated and the entire German war machine is all on the Eastern Front, then that's, I don't know, that to me feels like a different story. I think a lot of people don't realize how on the ropes Russia was for a little bit, or the Soviet Union was for a little bit, concluding with Barbarossa. Had Germany had a little bit more steam, or the Soviets had a little less steam, that kind of final blow, if Germany could have taken one or two cities like Moscow and Stalingrad, or Leningrad and Stalingrad, or something like that. I mean, they were far away from Stalingrad by that point, but if the British were actively sending in supplies and they had extra tanks and maybe extra men or volunteers, and the Soviets had no lend-lease to rely on for their second wind that they got to mount their own offensives, I mean, that would have been really, really tough. I don't know. It could have also ended with not the destruction of the Soviet Union, but the partitioning of most of its land, and then a Soviet state existing past the Urals or something like that. I don't know. So it's very hypothetical. I mean, this is like the largest military invasion in all of history, and then trying to guess what would have happened if one little factor changed, or a large factor in this case changed, that's tough. But yeah, I guess that's my answer for that. Okay, Browns fan is asking, what do you think would have happened if Mosley gained more traction and took power in Britain, and do you think they would get along with the Nazis? So I already answered most of Browns fan question with the whole British support for Germany, because Mosley was led the British Union of Fascist Party. That doesn't necessarily mean he would have joined the Axis, right? Because the Spanish had the Nationalist Party. They weren't explicitly fascist necessarily, but they had fascist elements to them. But the Nationalists took over and they were quite friendly with the Nazis, but they didn't help them. So even if Mosley, in fact, they didn't lend-lease him or anything because they went through a civil war. So then we have to think, would Britain have gone through a civil war? Because part of the reason Spain didn't get involved, a good part, was because they were so devastated from their own civil war. So if Britain had their own civil war, they certainly wouldn't have helped the Germans or anybody at all at that point, because they would have just been focused on rebuilding. If he had a clean power takeover, then it's kind of referring back to my old answer. If the British were enthusiastically fascist in helping out the Germans, then I would say that like 60 to 70% win rate on the German side, just because, not because the British would have had like the best army and they could have tipped the scales and they would have sent a whole expeditionary force. It's just that they could have stopped the Lend-Lease. Not only would they have stopped sending the resources, but they could have stopped America and cut off that trade from sending resources, and they could have sent their own resources to Germany. So that's where I just think that helps on the logistics side so much. That's the biggest principle for me there. Otherwise, yeah, I won't go. If I answer that question, it's going to sound a little redundant. One thing I will say, though, is Britain was pretty reluctant toward adopting. Like, fascism is it's not like a Hearts of Iron thing where you can promote a party and the party just takes over and now the country's fascist. I think the country has to have a feeling where the populace is dissatisfied and disgruntled or oppressed, or has something to blame, or they have a struggle and they want to blame it on another nation or on another group internally. A lot of these things all need to add up to each other too. And Britain at that point had a large empire. They had won the First World War. They were isolated with their own kind of issues. There was no one really on the border who was an existential threat. To the Germans, they had an existential threat, humiliation, someone to blame within their own borders. I mean, a lot of things lined up. It's not like Germany magically became fascist. So for the British to become fascist, it'd be kind of like, the way I'd see it is more like Italy. But even Italy felt humiliated at the end of World War I. Britain didn't. So they would be, if we see Italy as pretty reluctantly fascist, like the people are not, I mean, the moment the Allies landed on Sicily, bang, the government fell. That's how fragile it was. So if we're looking at Britain, who didn't feel any sense of humiliation, and they weren't undergoing a massive economic struggle in the same way that the Germans were necessarily, then I don't really see them being that enthusiastic. So one correction I'll say, if for this particular scenario where Mosley takes over and Britain is just fascist, and they have the population doesn't really support fascism at all, then they're kind of just like in this weird neutral state where they're not supporting anyone, and then it's kind of like a showdown between the Germans and the Russians or the Soviets. And then America could still intervene. And in that case, I think the Allies are still going to win. It's just a delay. But I don't think Mosley, like if you look at the rallies, not a lot of people supported him. And there were always counter rallies that were like 2 times the size. No one really liked him. I don't think he had the charisma, but more importantly, Britain didn't have the feeling that they were betrayed, humiliated, like any of these things. Of course, there were economic hardships in the 20s and 30s, but it just wasn't at the level as it was in Germany. And it didn't breed that level of radicalization and reactionary force.
Thanks for listening. To hear the full version of this chat, become a Sarge or Officer tier member over on armchairhistory.tv. Use code ArmchairChats for 60% off of your first month.